Okay, I now call this special session of the West Dallas West Milwaukee School Board Education to order. Suzette, can I have the roll?
Yes. Mr. Sikich?
Present.
Ms. Deal?
Present.
Mr. Burns?
Present.
Mr. Eustress is excused. Mrs. Justum?
Present.
Mrs. Carr?
Here.
Mrs. Kaiser? Here. Mr. Keller?
Here.
President Lee?
Here. All right, so we're going to be discussing tonight the compensation plan that we started in a workshop last week, or a couple weeks ago now. And so before we start, I just want to make sure that we had some questions. We had a document that we were utilizing for inputting questions and getting some responses so we could have a good evaluation of this and good discussion here tonight. Some of the questions weren't exactly focused on what this compensation plan is currently, and we just want to make sure that our discussion tonight is really focused on that, because that is what we're going to be possibly considering here later tonight, is passing that if we do decide to take action. All right? So with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Mr. Thompson and Caitlin.
Good evening, everybody, once again. Thank you very much for this opportunity. We're excited to be able to have another conversation about the compensation model. And so we are going to be working through another kind of PowerPoint presentation, addressing some of those questions that Mr. Lee just referenced, and providing the Baird models that at our last meeting we weren't able to produce. And so a lot of good information. Again, we're excited, and thank you for this opportunity. So before Caitlin and I get started, just wanted to refresh everybody's memory in regards to the components of the recommended compensation model. And those are up for you to review, but once again, the multiple components of the compensation model are: number one, to find an average salary for years of service in the West Dallas West Milwaukee School District. That would provide initial placement if the compensation model does get approved. So that would be based on years of service in West Dallas West Milwaukee, and then some other criteria of master's degree compared to a bachelor's degree, then looking specifically at years of service and taking into account some of our veteran staff that have 20 plus years of experience, and then on the other extreme, those employees that are coming to us with 1 or 2 years of experience. And so one component, the first component, is bumping up our employees to the average if they are below the average of their years of service. If an employee is above that average, then they would be placed into the new compensation model at their current salary. And so that would be the big piece of number one. In addition, or at least more clarification, is letter C, that this new average salary becomes every professional educator's base salary for CPI purposes moving forward. Another component of the compensation model that has been discussed and we're coming forward from the committee is an annual increase of $200 every year. So every year that someone in our professional educator employee group returns to continue employment in our district, they would get a $200 increase. We also have a component of earning micro-credentials, which are aligned to our strategic plan. Once again, each micro-credential with a maximum of 3. So there'll be offerings of 3 micro-credentials, 2 or 1. And each one of those micro-credentials has a value of $100 with a maximum value of $300 annual for an increase if an employee would take the full amount of micro-credentials. The fourth component that we talked about is a CPI increase. And once again, something that's important to note that we spent a lot of time discussing is that this is an annual board approval item. And so it's listed here as part of the compensation model, but then again, it does need to be approved by the board on an annual basis. So additional updates. As we went through all the variations of trying to find the most equitable starting path for our professional educators, our salary for a new hire or someone, an employee coming into our district new first year, our starting salary increased with this new model. It went from $42,000 to a new starting salary of $43,250, which would be put into effect at the 21-22 school year. Another very important conversation that we've had is this idea of retroactive microcredentials. And so we've had a number of employees that have taken the microcredential offerings on their own. And the committee felt it was appropriate to compensate those employees that took the classes previously. And so that would be built into stage one of the compensation model, would be these retroactive microcredentials and payment for those employees. So these are the Baird examples, and I want to just kind of work through these. So these are comparables from Baird Financial Services. The districts are just local districts, and the ones that I chose to use as examples are the Franklin School District, Milwaukee Public Schools, the Oak Creek School District, and at our last meeting, Wauwatosa, I think, was asked to be brought up, and so Wauwatosa was included on this. And so as we work through this, and as you're able to kind of look this information over before coming to this meeting, we're going to be focusing on 3 different sets of pictures, okay? And so we're going to be looking at salaries of the West Allis, West Milwaukee School District compared to these 4 other neighboring districts. We're going to be looking at fringe benefits, and then we're going to be looking at the total compensation package. And this was a really important part of our committee work, is when we started breaking this down and looking at these analytics, because I think the picture itself is a pretty powerful message. And so beginning here, up on our screen, we have the Franklin Public Schools compared to West Allis, and this first comparison is for salary. So if you look on the bottom of this chart or graph, it's the maximum years of experience, and then going up the left-hand column is a salary amount up to $100,000. You can see a dotted line that has an upward motion as you go from 0 to more years of service, and that would be the average salary for, again, that year of service. If you look at this, comparing the Franklin School District, again, to WAWM, you can see that Franklin, which appears to be light blue triangles, does offer higher salaries to their professional educators. You can see that in regards to this, WAWM is really close to that average line for salaries. So again, continuing to work with the Franklin School District, we're now looking at fringe benefits. And so again, and this is where this visual starts its impact, I think. So again, here's salaries, where you can see kind of, again, Franklin coming in at a higher salary offer. But then when we look at fringe benefits, you can see there's a huge movement of our school district up above that average line. And so again, there is separation, but you can see more of a movement up to be equal with that of the Franklin employees. And then the final slide is looking at the total compensation package. And again, you can see that although there are salaries that are higher or packages that are higher, it's pretty comparable in regards to the offerings of our school district compared to the Franklin School District. Caitlin, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add, okay. And if there's any questions as we're going through this, please ask. So if you need to see anything again, or please ask questions as they come up. So the next district that we looked at was MPS. And when Caitlin and I were kind of talking about this, just the sheer number of employees in MPS kind of makes this information kind of intense looking at it. But again, you can see when it's basically solely based off salary, you can see that MPS salaries are once again higher than the West Allis, West Milwaukee School District salaries. Here, like we saw with Franklin, you can see once we start looking at the fringe benefit packages, you can see that West Allis, West Milwaukee, once again, significantly increases and is actually higher in some regards than the MPS fringe benefits. And then, once again, the total compensation is pretty similar. Again, because of the total number of employees, it looks, I think, a little different than what the information is showing us. That it's pretty comparable between MPS and the West Dallas West Milwaukee School District when we're looking at total packages offered to professional educators.
Jeff, can you go back one slide, please? So we've seen this 2 times now with the actual fringe benefit cost, and we seem to have 3 tiers of employees. And I'm presuming that is based on when they are entered into working here at the district. Is that a correct assumption?
You mean like years of service?
I presume, because you see 3 lines, right? Am I not the only one who sees this?
Yeah.
You have a very high tier, a middle tier, and a few people in the
My
low tier.
estimate would be that the high tier is for people that have selected family plans, that the middle one is probably people who selected single plans, health insurance and dental, and the bottom one is probably people who have selected neither health insurance nor dental insurance.
Okay, and so then their benefits are life insurance only, or?
So then I call them percent benefits, but it's FICA, Medicare, WRS, or the alternative, Social Security alternative, and life insurance.
Got it, okay, thank you.
Good question.
Again, moving through our examples, now looking at the Oak Creek School District, again, kind of a repetitive story when you're just looking at salary comparisons. Here we have the fringe benefits, and again, what Mr. Lee just referred to with kind of that 3 tiers, but again, you can see that strong movement of our professional educator employee group moving up above that average and becoming more aligned to the offerings of the Oak Creek School District. And then finally, a similar pattern where we see some consistency when you look at total compensation packages. The last example that we have is in regards to the Wauwatosa School District, and here you can see that our salaries are very similar to that of the Wauwatosa School District. Again, the same pattern when we're looking at fringe benefits. And then finally, looking at the total compensation, again, very much aligned. Again, equal distribution of kind of right above that average and a little below that average, but pretty much very comparable to the Wauwatosa School District. So this part of our presentation is going to refer to the questions that Mr. Lee referenced in the FAQ. At the time that we put this together, there were only 3 questions, and so that's why the 3 questions are part of this presentation, but we'll talk about all the questions that came up. And so, Ms. Raymer, I don't know if you want to address the micro-credential questions.
Yeah, so a couple of the questions that came up on the FAQ, one of them was around why the compensation committee weren't the ones who selected which micro-credentials go into the catalog. And the summer PD catalog is something that we've had for the last 3 summers, and it is aligned specifically to our strategic plan. And the compensation committee was really designed to be a short-term committee. They were designed to help get a recommendation to the board for a compensation plan, and then that committee would finish. But we do have a professional development committee that worked with me all of last year for the first time because we really wanted to increase the amount of opportunity teachers have to give input into the things that directly affect their roles. So we had 1 representative from every single school, as well as our curricular leads that participated with us to help plan the district-wide PD days. They helped us plan the summer PD catalog for last summer. And we did reconvene that group of teachers to give a lot of input into what the summer PD catalog would be for this summer that was then potentially tied to micro-credentials. And that committee will continue to meet all of next year. Hopefully the world being able to go back to normal and we can do some district-wide PD days. That team will meet again, and they really did quite a bit of work last year to understand how do we get what we need to hold in common at all 18 school sites that's aligned to our strategic plan, to be consistent across what we do as a whole district, and then where does it need to be personalized for teachers within their personal journey, and where does it need to have choice. So that committee already meets regularly to talk about professional development, and since the micro-credentials were tied to professional development, we thought it was more appropriate to have those tied to that particular committee and their work that they do. And then the unpaid, a couple questions on unpaid committees that serve as a micro-credential. Right now, the unpaid committees haven't been something that we considered for a micro-credential, because micro-credentials by definition really are aligned to helping growing practice so that we see an increase in student achievement. So right now, we don't have any committees. There was another question on the FAQ about if we had a committee that was designed to do those things that isn't a paid committee, would we consider that for a micro-credential? And of course. The PD committee gets paid an hourly rate to attend that committee. But that, for example, would be a perfect example of if that was an unpaid committee, would that be something that going forward we would consider for a micro-credential? And sure, because it's obviously related to understanding the bigger picture of our strategic plan and how does that increase outcomes and opportunities for all students. And then partial micro-credentials. Yep, we have thought about partial micro-credentials. We have thought about extended micro-credentials, micro-credentials outside of our district, inside of our district, anywhere we can find them, that we think will help provide a lot of choice for our staff and yet really move the work forward towards the goals of our strategic plan. For this first year, it was quite a task just to get us organized up until this point, but that's the point of an ongoing PD committee as well. Because there will be lots of things that we're going to discover after this first cycle that we want to tweak and we want to add. And people will say, hey, could I have more time to complete that? Could we start some sessions in the summer and have them run during the school year? Maybe. If that's what meets people's needs, we're pretty wide open to how we can best do that. But first, we're going to try this and get some feedback on it, and then we'd be more than open to considering doing all kinds of different things that better meet the needs of staff as we go forward. And I think that was it on micro-credentials. Does anyone have any questions on that portion of it that I can answer while we're kind of on that section?
Kristen?
Oh, Kristen?
Was the designation of $100 per micro-credential based off of looking at, so let's say the teachers did 3 and got $300. Is that related to a general percentage increase?
The $100 is related ultimately to a period of time that each micro-credential would take for an educator to complete. So not necessarily a percentage increase, but more aligned with an hourly kind of requirement or what we figured would take for to complete each micro-credential. And we started with a much greater number of hours, and when we started looking at what was more sustainable for our school district going forward, we adjusted, and we're looking at that $100, we adjusted the hourly requirement for those micro-credentials to kind of be more in line with what we were able to compensate for those micros.
And can you remind me of the average amount of time it should take to finish each one?
Yep. So for one micro-credential, we said anything up to 15 hours. For 2 micro-credentials, it's 16 up to 40 hours, and then anything over 40 is going to be 3.
Okay, thank you.
That's how we've adjusted them. We went backwards by about 10 hours per micro-credential once we saw the dollar amounts that were associated to each. An important thing to remember about those is, although that does not sound like a very good hourly rate, right, for the micro-credentials, those are also being added to that total salary compensation. And so they compound over time. And so in the total picture, if you did all of the components, the annual increase looks really different. We didn't want to tie all the eggs to that basket because it may not work for some staff to be taking courses in the summer or after school or whatnot. But at the same time, we also want staff being able to do that where they can. So it was important to make sure that that was a component in there and that, again, it was financially sustainable over time.
Okay.
Other questions on the micro-credentials? So I had one. Sorry, I don't know if I should put my hand up or something, but, so can you just remind the hourly requirement is not solely the actual doing the PD or whatever, but it also included the follow-up
Yep.
reflection or whatever was required for that, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So that includes all of the time we thought it would take you to get from point A to submitting completed for the micro-credentials. So we allotted a couple of hours to write the reflection, a couple of hours of teacher planning time, because they had to do something with the information that they learned, as well as the in-seat instruction time. So lots of that are times that the professional educator would dedicate either, on their own time, but very flexibly. Those are not seat time hours in a course at all. Most of the seat time hours in the courses for the 1 credit micro-credentials are somewhere at around 6 to 8, and then kind of goes up from there depending on the course.
Was it considered, because we talk about a reflection and we talk about the lesson planning portion of it, was it considered, instead of having both of those things required for the micro-credential, to have like one or the other required?
It was really, the lesson planning portion is going to be tied to some of the micro-credentials. The other micro-credentials are really, did you do some mindfulness activities with your class that you wanted to capture, right? So you learn about something. Let's say I took the mindfulness class, and then I'm going to actually go do mindfulness lessons with my students. And so that's going to be tied to a couple of things. It might be a time I want to then tie that piece of it to my educator effectiveness, and I want somebody to come in and observe me doing that. But the committee was really specific that they wanted that kept separate from the micro-credentialing piece. So the reflection is really an important piece of it because it allows the professional educator, I'm not checking their work, they're writing their own reflection that says, this is how I believe my practice has shifted based on the thing that I did. And again, that was important to the committee, that it's really about the professional educator and the way that they make growth. So there's nothing to be turned in necessarily after, like the lesson plan part. We wouldn't collect anything like that or do anything like that because that felt a lot more like us checking or evaluating the work versus really just saying, this is your personal reflection and check you did it, or no you didn't, and here's another opportunity to turn it back in.
Okay, so for each micro-credential, the requirement is whatever hours is to do the actual training portion of it, plus a reflection, and that is it?
Yeah, and there's obviously something that you learn how to do. In order to reflect on something, you have to have done it, right?
Uh-huh.
So we built in some hours to say, this would be the kind of hours it might take you to try that in your classroom. I'll go back to the example of mindfulness. I'm actually going to have to spend a little bit of time planning whatever activities I want to do, or when do I want to do these mindfulness lessons, or how do I want to incorporate that into my classroom. So we tried to take that time into account, but there's not really show me a videotape of you doing that or something like that, because that again became very evaluative. And so then the other time is just in writing the reflection. When I thought about how I wanted to implement mindfulness in my classroom, I did the following things. Here's what I'm seeing in my students now that we're doing that on a regular basis. So it's really what the teacher chooses to report back about their own process of the learning.
And that's the teacher committee that's going to be reviewing that?
That one is a different committee because, again, we're trying to have as much representation as possible. And I wanted to be sure that we had some people from the compensation committee that had an opportunity to participate in the micro-credential process. So that committee has, right now, in its suggestion, myself, somebody else from our team, an elementary principal, a secondary principal, at least one member of the compensation committee, a member of the education association, and then either somebody from our business office or our HR office. And that part was important because there are a lot of hours that staff are putting in on this, and as we're deciding what dollars to dedicate to what, it was important that our business office and HR get to kind of see the whole process all the way through so we can be sure it's not overtaxing the system the way we currently have it proposed. And that committee would then meet twice a year to just say, here's the reflections. Yes, you did it. No, you didn't.
Okay, so the content of the reflections isn't as important, it's just that you physically did it. Is there like a length requirement or
Yep,
certain
there's
questions?
there are 4 guiding questions that we put together at the PD committee and with our leadership and learning team, and then we said like a 2 to 3 page requirement that answers these 4 questions. What did you learn? How does your practice shift over time? And so it just gives them, they can't remember the other 2 right off the top of my head, but I could look them up. But it gives that just educators some guiding questions. And the answer is, did they answer the 4 questions? Yes. Did they not answer the 4 questions? No. And if they didn't, then we send it back and say, hey, we just didn't really see question 3. Can you resubmit it? But it really isn't about Deidre did a good reflection and Caitlin did a bad reflection, or vice versa. It's really about, did the educator do that, take the time to reflect and grow in their own practice? And that's really it.
And this came from committee, or is this something that administration thought was important to implement for this, for the compensation plan to be able to award the micro-credentialing, the reflection portion of it?
The reflection portion is a typical part of a micro-credentialing system. That's not unusual. And that's really where the educator demonstrates that they're making that shift of practice that's good for kids, right? Is their own reflection. We could have said, lots of districts, it's tied then to educator effectiveness. And so if you did a micro-credential, then a principal has to come in and do an evaluation of you. And our compensation committee said, under no circumstances did they want this tied to this. That was one of their very clear objectives. So we had to make sure there was a system that still allowed there to be a whole process of a cycle of continuous improvement, but that it wasn't at all tied to their evaluation system. And so this would be the other way that you can do the full cycle of continuous improvement without it being tied to evaluation.
The other piece of this is so that our internal micro-credentials have some kind of consistency and alignment with ones that teachers will go out and request to have included. So one of the big platforms that you could go to NEA, National Education Association. They have built an enormous platform now of micro-credentials for educators. And the expectations of completing and demonstrating you're actually learning what the micro-credential is supposed to help you with is much higher than the bar we've set internally. So we thought there has to be some alignment here if somebody's going to go out and take an NEA micro-credential or take one of ours. So it's a little bit of we have to live and learn inside of the system for a little while. And some teachers will take a university course, which will have even higher expectations yet. So it's just trying to find the balance in all of that as we try on the new systems. And so I think the lesson plan, the reflection are reasonable and are in line with what, generally in line with what we're seeing in the NEA platform.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for me? Okay.
Maybe, hang on.
Oh, Brendan has a question.
Why the big spectrum of hours for each level of credentials? So you're at up to 15 for one, up to 40 for two, and then 40 plus is 3. Looking at the PD site, if you pick the first 3 single micro-credentials, it adds up to 34 hours. And if you pick PBL boot camp for 2 micro-credentials, it's 2. And so you're able to actually then get $300 for less time than what it takes to earn $200 by taking that one. So, like, how does this not turn into a game where it's about jumping through hoops rather than actually the value of the credential itself?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Brendan. And some of those are, again, at the present moment, each developed by one leader who's doing each one of those courses, and there's going to be lots of time that we have to calibrate on all of those as we go forward. How many hours is this one? We've done a bunch of that so far. Some of them are, the PBL bootcamp has a lot more follow-up to it than the actual seat hours that are in there. And at some point, what we wanted to be sure was in the micro-credential catalog were every one of the courses that we really believed firmly are the things we know. And that was the first question I asked the PD committee, was name for me a professional development you've participated in that really moved your practice. And they spent some time in small groups making a list. And what's on that PD catalog right there are all the things that they put on the list, minus 1 or 2 that were just a little bit more obscure, that they said, this is the professional development I've participated in that really moved my practice. And that's why those are the ones that were chosen. So if it was a game where somebody was just trying to check the check boxes and get as many as they could, they're never gonna take something, and because they complete that whole reflective cycle, they're never gonna take something that isn't beneficial to meeting the goals of our strategic plan. But there is no doubt that there's probably a combination you could find in there of a bunch of those, where you could work the system to do less hours for more at the same time. And that's part of why there is such a range. The hours range was something that, again, we're creating as we're going forward, and we try to use a logical system of looking at like university hours and how many are tied to 1 credit, but then not making them quite as intensive as that, and how many are tied to 2 credits. So it was a system that we used to get this far. And I can't promise you that there's not gonna be a bunch of things that we wanna say after the first year, like, oh, we're gonna shift this, how many hours this is. We've already made some adjustments once we started to see the dollar amounts to those hours. We're gonna do the courses for the first year, and we might make more adjustments to it after that.
Because even at university level, there is a certain standardization of hours per credit.
Yes.
That come into it, so.
That is true. But again, some of these are really specific on a particular content, and because they each were developed by individuals that are running those are things that we'll have to calibrate on as we get through that first summer.
Who's overseeing that?
I am.
And is it true that once you take a PD for micro-credential, you can't like repeat take it again? It's like a one, I mean, you could take it again if you want, but you're not gonna get micro-credentials for it.
Correct, yeah. So eventually, this catalog has to have a pretty regular process of reflection, because there's going to be a point, there's 2 educators right now who came to one of our open sessions to learn more about this, who actually are pretty close to exhausting all the options. They've taken every opportunity that has come their way. They're close to exhausting some of the options that are in there. And so that, they can use other things as well. But if every one of our educators took every option that was in that PD catalog, we'd be doing pretty well by our students. Because those are the things, again, that teachers who have taken them said that really, really moved my practice. There were 4 or 5 other things in the catalog at its draft when we took it to the first committee meeting, and they said, no, that one really didn't, we didn't really get any traction out of that one. Or there was a couple that we said we didn't have enough. The feedback we got on that one last summer was that it wasn't that impactful, so we removed some of those, because we really wanted to be specific to the things people are interested in and the ones that they'll actually take.
Other questions? Going once, twice. All right, I think we're safe.
Okay. I'll just be right here in case anybody thinks.
All right, so another piece of the analysis of our draft compensation model was comparing our starting salaries and our high salaries with area school districts. So our new high salary is based on that move to the average. So all of the work that we've done in finding the similarly situated employees, that's how this new higher starting salary was created. So this $43,250 would represent our new starting salary to go along with this compensation model. We're currently at $42,000. So in this group of area school districts, you can see where that sets us. That $43,250 is what's currently in there with the green highlight. And then on the high salary side, this is the high salaries of area school districts. And I just have to note that this isn't quite necessarily apples to apples, because some school districts represented their current high salary and some districts reported their high maximum salary. But it's a relative similar number, but you can see that's why we're having the greater contrast between the high salaries. But in this new compensation model, the high salary maximum, or the cap that would be put on our highest earning educators, would be $90,000. And you can see again where that one falls in our current, in the model compared to other area school districts. And our current high salary that we have an educator earning is $88,650. So there's still a little bit room to grow for somebody on our highest end of our scale at the current moment.
Real quickly, I just wanted to once again walk through the individual paths for initial placement into this compensation model. We've spent a lot of time talking about bumping to the average and how do we come up with that. So, and there again was a question in the FAQ that kind of asked about a year 15 teacher, new to our district, 15 years of experience, how did they get placed? And so kind of the process that will follow is with every new employee, or with every employee, the first question that gets broken down is years of service in West Dallas, then looking at whether or not they have a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, Then we have another layer of looking at whether their current position is what we deem as a hard-to-fill position or a normal-to-fill position. And then we have another layer built into that where we try to recognize the years of service that our employees have or that employees are bringing to our district. And so that's broken down into 0 to 4 years of experience, 5 to 10 years of experience, and then 11 plus years of experience. That's how we kind of work through every employee in our district to come up with the averages for each year of service. That, again, we presented in our last presentation, and I believe it was part of the information that you've also had to review prior to tonight's meeting.
So just kind of a note on how that system was developed. And it was not the first iteration that Jeff just presented. That is after went through a number of different rounds of, does this make sense? We needed a consistent procedure, a rule of sorts to be able to apply consistently and fairly the process to create this step one of the new compensation model. So we actually started with just years of service and then found, well, that doesn't make sense because now we're just lumping bachelor's and master's into the same group. So we broke that out. And then we talked through, okay, well, some people who are in those hardest to fill positions are able to negotiate upon hire a higher starting salary based on the difficulty of that position to fill. And then we originally didn't have those additional years of total service, so years outside of West Dallas, West Milwaukee. And we found that in one of the circumstances, after finding the average before putting that additional layer into it, that we had somebody who was a year one with us and had 28 years of experience elsewhere. So again, we're like, well, we analyzed looking at the various values in our data to see, okay, are there outliers and why is this person an outlier? And then found, okay, well, we need to separate out total years of service. And originally we just had, okay, total years of service of at all. And then it was, okay, well, this person had 28 years and this person has 10. So we broke that down once again to those few categories of 2 to 4, 5 to 10, and 11 plus. So that's how that whole system was developed. It was based on kind of going through living and learning, looking at the data, finding the outliers, why do they exist, and then finding a consistent rule that could be applied to this first step of this first phase of the compensation model. Okay, and so while Jeff's going to pass out a handout that we'll go through in just a minute, but the intention of this whole process was to bring equity and consistency to a system that was sort of all over the place. So we are working with data that is real. These are actual current salaries that exist, and they really didn't have a method to the madness. They might have upon hire, but as we look at everything across the board, they really kind of didn't show a nice pattern based on years of service or based on degree or position. So we're working with the data that exists, and this was the consistent process that was developed in order to find those averages for this first phase of the compensation model. So what Jeff is passing out now is also on your
So then,
screen.
Caitlin, can
Yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
ask a quick question? So, yes, so you diligently went through and added all of that criteria. So according to this spreadsheet, though, there are a couple of discrepancies. There are still some teachers where when they look at it, they go, ooh, I have a master's and this person has a bachelor's, and they're still making more. So it's cumulative. It's all of those things, not just the one thing. It's like,
Exactly.
it's got to be all of them, right?
Yep.
I
And that's-
think, and I would just like to say that I feel like that's really got to be made clear to teachers. It's not that you have a master's and I have a bachelor's, but as a bachelor's I'm making more than you. I also have these things in place. So I think that that's unclear.
Okay.
And also, where the teachers will be starting, like their lane, like if we would go and we would vote to move this forward or whatever, like how do they know what lane they will be in? That's something that is concerning to them. If you can make a note and even talk to us about that, like, how would we roll this out to teachers so that they would understand Specifically, I wrote it down. So how do teachers know what lane they're in if the new plan is implemented? Specifically, teachers want to know if it's based on years of service with West Dallas, West Milwaukee, or years of service. And you just explained all that, but how does, that's important information. And we're going to need to make sure that we talk to teachers about that.
Yes, absolutely. So the initial thought in how that information is distributed is ultimately a complex mail merge, where we take
Okay.
all of the data that we have and it says, we show that you have X years of service with West Dallas, West Milwaukee.
Okay.
You have a master's degree.
Okay.
You are in a position that's categorized as hard to fill or not necessary, or our regular position in terms of being able to fill. And then finally, you have total years of service of X. And therefore, the cell that you are in is, this is the average for that similarly situated, very specific group of employees that fit all those same criteria,
Yep.
which is the chart that we're looking at that you have
Okay.
in front of you.
All right,
now.
there we go,
So
there
that
we
would be
go.
how we would
Okay.
present that information. So
Right.
it'd be like all of the pieces, and here's where you are.
Yes, because I do feel like you've thought this all through. It's just a matter of having everybody understand that
Absolutely.
and show your thinking.
And we, thank you for the comments, because this is the thing over and over that we said, how do we make sure that everybody understands? This is,
Yes.
I'm
Right.
in a fireworks show here. How do you make sure that,
Right.
everybody understands that this piece, because this is a huge change,
Mhm.
and it's a one-time change, but this is a large change to implement, and we need to make sure that everybody does understand exactly what it means for them and where they fall.
Right.
And two, I think as I kind of figure out what's going on here, the communication piece is extremely important because people are going to be leaving this school year, ending this school year with this idea of a contract.
Mhm.
And then if this does get moved forward, there's going to be a number of employees that are going to find out that they're being bumped to an average, which changes that salary. So the communication piece is going to be
Yes.
extremely important.
Yeah, some of what we've seen in some of the districts that we've studied, they put out videos, so we'll do that same kind of
Okay.
work with a presentation that's narrated so that we can distribute that to everybody. They can go back to it and watch it so that, teachers have some time in the summer. So we'll build some tools, because I agree, I think communicating this effectively is gonna be even more challenging, I think, than trying to figure out
Yeah.
how to get to this level.
Mhm.
And I think we have to be mindful of that we've been so deep in this for so long
Yeah.
that it's kind of built in our brains. And to explain it to somebody that is gonna ask the question like, wait, there's a different way we get paid now? That's where they're gonna start from.
Yeah.
So that side of it will be the next
And
layer
now
of
you're,
work.
and now the board is getting like this workshop, and we're like, oh, okay, yeah, and now I've heard that 3 times. Okay, now I understand. Now I see what you're doing. But, boy, we're gonna have to really make that a point, and it sounds like you guys understand that, okay.
Yeah, and Jane, also, just so you know, when I did the information sessions about micro-credentials, I
Mhm.
highly encouraged all of our staff to either Zoom in tonight to listen as well, to watch the recordings of the presentation that were done last time, as well as this time, and showed a few people where they could find those on our website. Because I
Mhm.
think the more detail people have and understand, the better it is for everyone.
Good.
And just one other comment that I wanted to make. I think something that's really unique and neat about the model that our committee came up with is that it's individually based. And so we're talking about, here's your starting point, this idea of steps and lanes, and then move. Once our employees are placed, they control the next steps of what that's going to look like in regards to circumstances in life, at the current time, but with micro-credentials and things like that. So it's an individual ladder once our employees get placed, if this does get moved forward.
Right.
So, once again, a lot of numbers here, but you can see that these are the average salaries for each of those years of service in the West Dallas, West Milwaukee School District. And then you can see where it's broken down to 4 or less, 5 or 10, or 11 plus. So again, the first cell, 43,250, would be the new starting salary for a new hire into our district. And then it goes from 43,250 to 43,976 to 43,852 to 44,957. And so again, this is under the kind of the path of a bachelor's degree and 4 or less years of experience. Moving over to 5 to 10 years of experience, I'm going to start at 46,435 for the 5th year. 6th year, 46,832, and you can just kind of see the flow moving down. I don't know if I necessarily need to read through each cell. But again, the criteria that we've talked through, that is how we came up with these averages. And so again, through communication, I left this school year thinking that my salary for next year was going to be this. Now I'm seeing these numbers, that this is the average. Okay, I fall into. So again, there could be movement with certain employees that get bumped up to these new averages based on the criteria that we used. And then you can, just one other note that I'll share here is looking at the masters, and so it's column E. You can see that if I am a new employee with 4 or less years of experience, my starting offer would be 43,250. If you look, if someone coming in has a master's degree, 4 or less years of experience, that new starting conversation would be at 46,743. And then you can just see, once again, how it plays out depending on years of service and things along those lines.
Brandon?
In the 5 to 10 years, row 4 has you at 53,000, row 5 has you at 49,000.
Yeah. Same with the last column too, they go down and then up, then down.
And
It's possible, based on coming out of the previous performance compensation model, that there will be people with more years of service making less money. That can happen in the new model as well, based on the choices employees make around how many micro-credentials they want to achieve. So I could be here 5 years and be making less than somebody that's been here 3, right? That's possible.
Right, no, I guess I'm talking in if you start at the year 1 at 5 to 10 years, so I guess somebody that's coming in with that much, their starting offer is 47,000. And year 4, they make 53,000, but then year 5, they lose money and make 49,000?
Yeah,
This, I think I'm understanding your question. This is just a starting point. So it's not that we, this is literally only for year 1. We don't follow this, okay, now I'm a year 2 and I make the next cell. This is only the starting point, and then every movement beyond this starting point is based on the other components of the compensation model. The micro-credentials and the annual increase, and then the CPI is outside, proved outside of this compensation model. But those are the ways in which an educator would move in their salary, not moving from one cell to the next. So this is just the start of the compensation model. This is the one-time placement. Yep.
So these are actual people. So you're not saying like, if I'm not gonna move
Yeah.
up in steps, this is where you're starting for the actual people. I think what we thought was this was gonna be a progression thing, but this is actual people's salary, this is where they will sit as of next year, and they can go up from there.
Starting point, yep. This is
Thank
how
you,
it's
Heather.
built into
Yeah.
the
Thank you.
Yeah.
model.
And
Okay.
thank you for all of these comments are super helpful, because like Dr. Lexman said, we have been in it. We are in the weeds. And so we just need the words, okay, we should have put that in here. This is the placement, this is the starting point, this is not a salary schedule. So thank you for these comments.
I think it's gonna take a long time for people to get salary schedule out of their head.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and we shouldn't present a chart then that looks like a salary schedule, so thank you for the comments.
But this is what we asked for, right? We wanted to see where these averages were falling. And these differences that we're seeing, what you're seeing, Brendan, is because of the cattywampus nature in which people were given salaries in this district in the past. And so yes, that it is weird to see someone who's coming in at year one, getting offered this much, and then the same person's gonna be average, who has 5 years' experience is less than that. That's just because that's how this system used to be. So it is gonna look weird to some people. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions that you guys are gonna have to field as to why this is how it is, but we went through the due diligence of making sure it was the average of what we have here, and we're taking into account not only what they did here, but what they did elsewhere, and the education that they've had to get here. So I don't know, I can't think of many other ways to, improve to try to be as fair as possible with what we have, and honoring the people who have spent so much time here in our district, and using that as a big point, not just overall education in general.
Sure. Well, and to what Heather said is that this isn't a salary schedule, even though it kind of looks like that. And so that's the misunderstanding. But I think that that goes back to what Jane's saying, is that we really need to make sure that when we're communicating this out, it's clear. And that we have, we've run through it and been like, this is what this actually means. And it's specific so that people aren't looking and being like, well, I'm losing money at year 5? Because then they're gonna be irritated, and we're gonna be having to fight to sell this, rather than being like, no, look, you guys are bumping up.
Yeah, and I think that those communication pieces will come once we get through this portion of it.
Hopefully, we gotta make the decision.
Exactly. All right, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
So just to present a little more information as we were looking at, because that was something that caught our eye too, was kind of we didn't want it to kind of be this roller coaster up and down. So when we really started going into the specific year and finding out, okay, what's the problem between, and I'm making this up, year 21 and year 24? How does that information come out this way? And if you recall, part of when we were finding the average is we were looking for an outlier, which means that if there was an employee that was making a salary that was $5,000 more than the next highest salary for that year of experience, that high salary was pulled out as an outlier, and it wasn't part of that average. And what you're gonna see in some years is that the average, the starting point, is $3,000 higher, again, I'm making this up, than the previous year. And that's because in that particular situation, we had 2 employees that had high salaries that weren't $5,000 apart, so there was no outlier. So that increased the average for that cell. Where in other cell years of experience, we may only have had 1 employee that made up that cell to find that average. And so there's so many layers and so many components to how these averages came to be and why one year looks different than the rest. It's the makeup of the actual employees, the actual salaries that we are working with to find that average.
Sorry. Technical difficulties. There we go. And then, okay. Thanks, Brian. Okay, so, we're gonna talk through now the financial piece and the sustainability piece, which are very complicated, especially at this moment in time with the state budget. So, and all of these factors play together in terms of our overall budget. And right now, we're at this point where the Joint Finance Committee is analyzing and editing the bill that the governor has put forward in terms of the state budget. So again, the state works on a biennial budget, so state is working currently on the 21-23 budget, which will affect our next 2 years. And mainly, the state budget affects some of our revenue factors in our budget. So currently, the Joint Finance Committee has put forward a proposal for a $0 revenue limit per pupil increase and less than 2% increase in the special ed reimbursement rate, which is drastically different from what the governor proposed, which we sort of assumed might happen. The Joint Finance Committee is suggesting that ESSER funding should be provided, that was provided to schools, to make state funding unnecessary. But this is sort of a dangerous proposition because we know that federal funds are one-time funds and tend to be used for limited purposes and not ongoing operational expenses. So it is irresponsible for us to use federal funding for ongoing operational expenses, because what happens is when that federal funding runs out, we have just supplanted, you know, our current operational expenses with federal funds, and once that those federal funds run out, we have now a cliff of expenses that we have been funding with the federal source that we no longer have. So I think the area school districts and Wisconsin school districts as a whole are speaking out to legislators, letting them know that this is sort of an irresponsible proposition, and we'll see where that goes next. Following steps are the Senate approves the budget, the Assembly approves the budget, and then the governor approves the budget. So it could be until August or September before we know the final budget, maybe even October. Hopefully it's before we approve our final budget in October. So the sustainability factor is one of the most complex factors in the model, even after all of the complex pieces that we've already gone through. So our annual budget is based on components dictated in the state's biennial budget, which we just talked through. And those factors are developed and decided by the state, not individual districts, which those factors then impact our own district's revenue. So this year, we could see potential significant impacts of the budget if what's moved forward is what the Joint Finance Committee has proposed. In conversations with area business managers, it is truly unknown how the politics of this year's budget will play out. There's, you know, the governor has just said he's going to plans on rerunning. There's so many different factors that could play into it, but ultimately, we have to wait until the state budget is known before it's recommended that we wait until the state budget is known before we move forward with some of our factors within our compensation model. And working with some of our most closely aligned area school districts, 4 out of the 6 have said that they are going to pause until the state budget factors are known before moving forward with compensation recommendations for the following year, for next school year, 21-22. So, and that is because our school districts rely so heavily on these state budget factors. And before addressing these other major components of expenses within our budget, which we talked through at length last time, we don't have that sustainability factor built in because we haven't addressed some of those major areas of expenses, that it is recommended at this point that we pause on some of the areas of our compensation model, which we'll talk through in just a slide or two, until we know some of those state budget factors, because they do play so heavily into our budget. For example, just that special ed piece, moving from 30% to a 50% reimbursement in special ed categorical aid could mean additional $1 to $2 million in our budget, which is huge. So, and we'll take, you know, all the questions that you have, but this is sort of wrapping up what we have today. So, as we've stated, a new compensation model is a large scale change, and we have investigated and analyzed and studied, but this is still a new system to us. So we have to live and learn. We have many components that we know have to be reflected on and analyzed on an annual basis, especially in these first few years. And all of the factors that we've worked through today are those factors. So does it meet the objectives of what we hoped that a compensation model would do? The course catalog, the sustainability, the processes in place, the committees that are in place in this model, reflecting on outside micro-credentials. All of these components of the compensation model we have to work through and live through, and even Brendan brought up tonight, like the hour requirements. That's a really good example of one of those factors that we, have to reflect on. So all of those pieces will have built into our system opportunities for feedback along the way, many of them, and this will have to be a model that we work through and live and learn to understand what areas need to be addressed and potentially changed until we find the exact model for us. And we have, in working closely with the area school districts that have similar models or a model that has some component of micro-credentials, each one has said, okay, they implemented it 6 years ago and they've reiterated it in a few formats and now they're at this stage. So it's not a one and done, it's a reflection process, an annual process, even more frequently than that, to understand what is it doing the goal that it intended to do for us, and is it meeting our objectives as a school district.
And since Caitlin talked about the objectives, I just want to again review real quickly the prioritized objectives of the compensation committee. So number one, moving to average salary, moving closer to the average salary in our area. A system that attracts and retains professional educators, a system that's transparent, and finally, financially sustainable are the objectives that our compensation committee felt was the most important. And so we are coming before the board tonight with a recommendation, and as Caitlin just spoke to, this recommendation is kind of in phases or stages based on the current information and current place that we find ourselves. And so at this time, we're asking the board to approve the move to the average for professional educator salaries for the start of the 21-22 school year. So that would be stage one. Stage two would be aligning approval of the following compensation model components to the 21-22 final budget approval in October. And that's where conversations would occur again in regards to retroactive micro-credential compensation as well as the annual increase. And then finally, another component of this is the board approving CPI, which is kind of the consistent process that's occurred on an annual basis. And so stage one is this move for a starting place on a new compensation model, which is moving to the average of your years of service in the West Dallas, West Milwaukee School District. And then there's other layers once more information comes out and hopefully things are clear around October in regards to next steps of the compensation model.
Questions from the board? Kristen?
I know we've discussed this, like with the CPI and everything. Right now, with a budget, let's say with no increase, basically what we're seeing, what the JFC is currently proposing, we can afford to do the first step there to move to the average. The second step would be based on what we get for a budget in October, hoping for either for an increase, or that also assuming no money coming, an increase.
Okay, that's a good question. So next week, June 14th is when we focus on the budget. We have a budget workshop. So right now, I'll just go kind of high level. We are at a deficit budget projected for next year, 21-22, of about $1.1 million, which is very normal at this point in the game. Each of the last many Junes, we have approved a preliminary budget that was a deficit budget with the intention of balancing it, and in fact did that before the final budget was approved in October. So that $1.1 million deficit does include all three components for next year. So it does include the move to the average, the retroactive micro-credential compensation, which ultimately just means people are earning their micro-credentials this year, because this is the new compensation model, and then, or I should say this year, in 21-22, and then in 22-23 is when all of those are compensated, and just next year is for the first time that the retroactive micro-credentials will be compensated. So that's what that piece means. And then the annual increase. We have a few ways in which we can balance our budget, which we'll talk through next week. And it is possible to do those components and balance our budget, but we have to work through some of the ways in which we can do that, which are some hard decisions that we would have to make. But ultimately, there are a bunch of factors that we have to just kind of wait out and see. For example, our health insurance increase. And a big one then is the state budget, what comes in for our per pupil revenue limit factor. So that's like a really long way to answer your question. That was
No,
sort of
no,
the
that makes
initial
sense. I'm
question.
glad you brought it up. I know we talked about this a little bit. I don't wanna get on everyone's bad side here, but like retirement benefits would re-looking at those in any way, shape, or form help us with our budget if we don't get, I mean, it's 99th percentile. Is that something where we can knock it down to 95th, 90th? So at least to support the teachers we have here who are, like we said, 72% of the district is less than 10 years, which leads me to believe they're young 20, 30, 40-year-old teachers who want to see a salary.
So changing the retirement benefits model is a long-term benefit for our budget.
Okay.
Not necessarily, unless you cut it off, people who are even retired, at this point, unless you break the agreements that were in place at the time of retirement, it's a long-term, a future savings for us.
Okay.
Which is something that we, I think, need to look at in the future, especially talking sustainability. But at this point, a change in the model wouldn't necessarily equate to a savings for next year.
Okay. Thank you.
Hmm?
Other questions? No other questions?
I have a-
Kristen?
More of a comment, like I do micro-credentials where I work, so obviously as a teacher, I'm very familiar with them. At least with ours, we get a 1% salary increase. And I know that's not very sustainable, especially for people on the high end of the salary. It's a lot of money. But even at the $43,250, starting 1 year bachelor's, it's not even 1%. So maybe it's something we'd like to look at. I mean, not this year, I know, because of the JFC and the budget is words I can't say on microphone. But it would be nice to be able to say, hey, it's a 1% salary increase to do this kind of work. I mean, I do my 12 credits a year. I get my 1% raise, and I'm happy with that. So at least that number sounds better than saying you're not even reaching a 1% in your first year teaching. You have more control, I think. It sounds like you give you more control over how your salary works out. So just something to think about for years where we have more.
The other thing to note is, though, it's not just, CPI could also be included in that, which is over 1% and has
True.
been for a number of years.
Yeah.
Along with the annual increase that you get if you just show up for work every day and don't get fired. So these are things that, the micro-credentials are in addition to that. And so, yes, by themselves, they aren't 1%, but we're talking about a whole compensation package here that if someone does the micro-credentials and gets the annual increase, and we are able to do CPI in some way, shape, or form in that year, they could get, 2-3% increase on their salary, depending on how all that shakes out.
Oh, I know, and as someone who's going through it, I just know the work that teachers do to get into these things. And so it's a lot. Like, I'm getting a student teacher next year and I get 6 credits for it, but the amount of hours I'm putting into it is way more than, looking at that. So I get it. I just feel like I need to say something on behalf of those of us who are doing that kind of work.
Mhm.
And yeah, to earn that 3% in various ways. I get it.
Brendan, did you have a question?
I do, but it's not fully formulated yet.
Okay.
I was hoping other people had questions.
Except, are you buffering?
Yeah. It's
Sorry,
a little slow, but
78%, we'll get there. Anyone else have questions or comments? So go ahead, Jeff.
I know this was supposed to be a one-time committee, but will this be reviewed thoroughly year after year with a new committee or by administration, or you haven't got that far to talk about that yet?
My assumption at this point is that the committee would stick together. This committee's been together for now going on 2 years.
I just had heard that from the teacher's side, they lost about 12 members of the committee that didn't show for some of the meetings, and I thought, well, that's not much input when you're losing that many staff members off the committee.
Yeah, for our meetings, we had consistently, I'd say probably about 20 teachers that were part of that, or professional educators that were part of those conversations. I know that I can think off the top of my head, there were two or three that were on the committee that weren't back when the committee reconvened. But my assumption would be that that committee, that core group of employees would.
still be around.
Yep, and we've talked that there's components of this that will need to be analyzed and reviewed and just kind of looked at to see.
And they'd be familiar with it, having talked about it this year.
And lived it.
One more question. Can you just help me out? 2 weeks ago, you talked that, mentioned that teachers were getting $400, but then that had to be changed to $200. Why was that again?
Yep, so that was one of our initial iterations of the components, so the micro-credentials and the annual increase. And just quite frankly, that was before I had factored in the compounding nature. So that was with my math when I had it as a supplemental one-time payment.
Makes sense.
And that compounding factor, that had to change for sustainability purposes.
Thank you.
And just to go back to Jeff's previous question too, is regarding feedback, is this will require widespread feedback from all facets of our teacher population. So in addition to just a committee, that will be a voice for annual review, that we'll have, we're still working, figuring out how that even plays out, what type of ways do people communicate feedback on the various components of this. So we're still working through that, but it will be more than, I think, feedback from just the sole committee, looking for wider spread feedback from our general teacher population as well.
So are we looking like maybe a survey or something that would go out to staff, say like,
That's my initial thought.
how's it going, and what do you hate, what do you like, sort of thing, and then maybe make adjustments based off of that? Jeff?
This is just a comment. I really like the catch-up part. It's gonna have some growing pains, but I think it's gonna make us a stronger district in acquiring new teachers. And I like the fact that, it may not sound like a lot of money, but that it's on your salary schedule. So it will compound, it's not a one-time payout. I like those two factors of it, so I'd like to compliment the committee on that.
And I just on that note too, when we look at, I know the $100 doesn't sound like a lot, but when you add in that compounding factor, on a first year's teacher salary, if an educator did those full micro-credentials of 3 each year, and then received the $200 annual increase, and in the model, it's a explanation of, or a projection of CPI of 2% just for calculation purposes, it's about a $1,600 average increase per year. So I just did the math,
I was just looking at the one, but no, thank you, I'm glad you did that.
Yeah, so that on a new educator salary is over 3%. On somebody who's making 60,000 is 2 point something percent. I just did the math. So that compounding nature is what makes the impact on the salary.
Okay. I can live with that.
Jean?
If we had best case scenario and our budget did pass and, or the state budget was not what we thought it was going to be, and we got the money and we could do this, would you consider, or could we consider retroactive for the other things that were being put on hold?
Best case scenario, if I look at our budget factors for next year, is still a deficit budget of $400,000. So I would suggest that we wouldn't add additional
Okay.
factors into that.
Okay.
Brendan?
Yeah. The hours with, I guess, more comment, the hours with the micro-credentials are a little bothersome to me because I know teachers already work a lot, and to jump through additional hoops to get the money and not have it kind of a standardized timeline. Just as a suggestion for future moving forward, if teachers are designing this, teachers being the go-getters that they are, something may end up being 60 hours just because they're super excited about it, not necessarily because it requires that much to demonstrate the learning. And I would suggest that maybe we look at, if we standardize the times per micro-credential, if someone has a 60-hour course that they've designed, we break it into 2, and then it can be two micro-credential ones or something, so that, like, just like in college, if you have your 101 and then you have 102 your next semester, like you have a secondary or more advanced level. And so I guess that's the one comment. The other thing that, I totally lost my mind on that. Never mind, I lost it.
All right, thank you, Brendan.
Yeah.
If it comes back again, feel free to.
I'll let you know, yeah.
All
the
right.
buffer.
Any other questions? Brian, did you have anything? No? Amy, you're right?
Everyone's been asking the questions that are popping up, so.
They're good questions. Heather?
I will just say, thank you for letting us have this couple weeks to review everything. After that long meeting, my brain was not comprehending what we were being, told, and I was completely like, wow. So it was good to have the time to review everything, and now this is so much clearer than it was, and I just appreciate everything. I mean, back in 2016, I was on that wonderful committee that set this up, and I remember the headache, so it's looking wonderful. It's looking way better than it was.
Brendan?
I remembered it.
Great.
The question I had, because our benefits were in the 99th percentile, and what can we do? Is there, I don't know if I missed it or not, is there something that we offer staff so that they don't take the benefits package?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, so the 99th percentile is for retirement benefits. And that stat is on a per pupil basis compared to per pupil retirement benefits across the state of Wisconsin, which is separate from a cash in lieu offering of health insurance or dental or whatever it might be, which we do not offer. And we've talked about that a number of times, and I actually just talked to some area school districts, really work with the local WASBO team, which is our southeastern Wisconsin WASBO, and get a lot of good information bouncing off back and forth. I've probably mentioned this group a few times in this, just tonight in our conversation, but in talking through that, there are some school districts who do a cash in lieu and some don't, and it would have to be fully analyzed. Some that are moving away from it now actually are realizing that there's a cash in lieu offering. When they offer it, oftentimes the number of the people who take it are those who would remain on their parents' benefits plan who are under age 26 anyway, and so we'd end up actually paying out more money, and those people wouldn't have even taken it. So it would have to be an analysis of the savings that we would actually see. Would it be equal to or more than the amount that we would pay out in a cash in lieu offer? So a full analysis that would have to be done, but at this time we do not have a cash in lieu offer.
I brought that up a number of years ago, and it was stated that a lot of times the healthier people will take that, and then you're left with the sicker people, and so then your loss ratios go up, and so then the rates go up along with it. So it's something that we have considered, but it's something we can continue to consider as a way to try and control some of those costs. Anything else? So before we move on, I just wanted to say thank you so much to the administrative team, Caitlin, Jeff, who spent many hours, and because of me, probably many more than he wanted to, on the different possibilities for this compensation model. We have been in the weeds. I haven't been as much as you guys, but I know that there's been so many different ways that this could be done, and coming up with a plan that would be sustainable, something that staff would be excited about and be interested in doing, and something that would be different enough that we could try to bring people to our district is not a small thing to do. So this is definitely a very Herculean effort, and I want to thank all those who have been involved in that. This is something that I wanted to do when I first joined the board, and I'm now in my 4th year of being on the board, so it's just taken a very long time to get to this point. And so I'm very thankful that we were able to get here at this point in time. So with that being said, I believe we can move right into the action item if we want to take action. And so as it's seen here for the recommendation from the district is that we would be approving at this time the catch-up, which is moving staff who are below the average for the groups that we talked about to the average. And then the remaining of this plan would be approved but not implemented. It's all 100% based upon what happens at the state level for our funding. Does everyone understand that that's what we're looking at right here? Okay, so I would then entertain a motion.
I move to approve.
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Is there any other further discussion? All right, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? That carries. I would then entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any last discussion? I mean, it's only 7:20. All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, meeting is adjourned.
Yay.